Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an absolute pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Ilford North, who speaks so eloquently of many of the things that I also see in my constituency, the other side of London, from him. The Chancellor started his speech by referring to people who get up early every morning, who open up factories, shops and building sites, and then implied he was about to make life better for them. Well, now some in my constituency have done well in recent years, but the vast majority of families, particularly families led by women, don't feel better off. It's hardly surprising when nationally real wage growth in the UK fell by 3% and in the last 8 years, and the impact of pay freezes and low pay falls hardest on women. This government has overseen the biggest rise in poverty since the 1980s, when we last had 8 years of Tory budgets. Now, I want to focus, Madam Deputy Speaker, on what this government has done to the children in these families, and particularly those children who need additional help. The Chancellor hardly mentioned children in his speech. And what they need is a budget that works for them, not a government driving an economy that means their parents' real pay is declining, creating a housing crisis that forces their parents to pay rent almost equivalent to their take-home pay, and a work culture that means that the only jobs their parents can get are zero-hours contracts, so they never know how much is coming in month to month. And no child in this country needs a government that makes a political choice to respond to the worldwide financial crisis of 2008 by implementing, then continuing with, politically driven austerity where the whole burden falls on the poor and the rich get let off scot-free. Austerity that means our public services continue to struggle with less money and more pressures. Madam Deputy Speaker, austerity isn't coming to an end, and let me cover some examples. The Local Government Association say government cuts mean councils have been forced to cut services, including the very services that are designed to help children and families with problems, but to get to them before those problems start and escalate. Cuts to children's centres, places that provide advice, information and support, cuts to youth services, etc., etc. And there's another 1.3 billion of cuts still planned for councils next year. My own council, Hounslow Council, has lost 80% of its government grant in the last 8 years, meaning a 40% loss of total real income. Councillors in Hounslow, as with across the country, are having to find more cuts. In Hounslow, another 27 million of cuts over the next 3 years, and 5.5 million of that has to come from education and early intervention. Madam Deputy Speaker, I saw nothing in the budget to address the growing number of children on child protection plans, which have surged 84% in the last 10 years. There's not enough to be able to reopen the youth centres that do such a great job identifying and supporting vulnerable youngsters before they get into real trouble. Now on schools, Madam Deputy Speaker, Councillor Tom Bruce, who's Hounslow's lead member for Children and Education, said to me, and I quote, "The government tell us that there is more money in schools than ever before. But if you ask the heads, the teachers, the pupils, the parents and the governors, that is simply not the reality." Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor's 400 million titbit for schools today won't replace the lost teaching assistants, the welfare and the counselling support that the heads have had to cut. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, on top of that, the government grant funding for children with identified additional education needs is not enough for the growing number of those children who should have benefited. Schools have had to cut specialists that provide these early interventions, and the NHS has had to cut the number of school nurses. And between these excellent professionals, they identify children at risk and families in crisis and support them. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the honourable member for Birkenhead, who rightly said the burden of austerity has fallen on those families with children who need to claim benefit, and it's driving them to destitution. Some of the symptoms of that extreme poverty include teachers having to buy shoes and coats and warm clothes for children whose parents can't afford them. Universal credit was rolled out in Hounslow 2.5 years ago in the first wave to affect families with children, and almost immediately, as we predicted, pressure on the food bank shot up. It's led to evictions from private tenancies, then queues of homeless families, many of whom have had to now take temporary accommodation, often at such a distance they're too far from work, from school and from their communities. Universal credit is claimed both by families with no adult in work because of disability and who are losing the additional benefits to cover the extra costs that they incur, but also working families. In fact, the majority of UC claimants in my constituency are in work. In West London, they would starve without their universal credit being honoured. That's because rents are £1,200 a month on average and take-home pay can hover around £1,500 and a lot less for a parent on a national minimum wage. So universal credit is leaving families in poverty, and for three main reasons. It's underfunded, it's chaotic, and it's designed as a punishment for being poor. Today's increases in work allowances only replace the cuts that were made previously, and the Chancellor's £2 billion for mental health is half what's needed. It's to fund a new mental health crisis service. But why wait for a crisis? Why not support early intervention? Madam Deputy Speaker, children in primary school now were born and have grown up only experiencing rising austerity and rising inequality, and from today's budget they will continue to do so for years to come, unless we have a change of government, a Labour government.
Hear, hear.